Welcome to our Getting Started with Remote Desktop Manager video series. This first video is designed to help IT administrators install and configure Remote Desktop Manager for the first time. It's also a great place to get insight and best practices to ensure that you and your team start off on the right foot. So in this video, we're going to take a look at how to configure and create your SQL data source, as well as have a brief overview of the authentication and login types. We'll register your license, create the unique Devolutions custom login account, as well as administrative accounts and user accounts. We'll also take a look at how to create user groups and vaults, as well as assign them permissions. And finally, we'll be adding a security provider, which adds additional encryption of the database to the already existing encryption on all of your passwords and sensitive data. And to wrap it all up, we'll give you a few options to deploy your RDM configuration to your end users as well as their workstations. To set the stage for this series, our user Bob is a sysadmin with a small team of technicians that wants to have a centralized place to securely share and access remote servers and keep all their credentials in one safe place. He's just purchased 15 licenses of RDM and has installed the latest version of SQL Server 2022 on his host machine. So the first step after installing RDM is to select a team data source. The data source is the link between the RDM application and its users and the shared database. Devolutions provides three main data source options to work with in a team environment: our very own cloud-based solution, Devolutions Hub, an on-premises solution, Devolutions Server, and we also integrate with Microsoft's SQL Server as well as Azure SQL. Now, for our example, we'll be using the SQL Server option. Then the data source configuration window will open, which is a place where we can create the database as well as edit any data source information. Most users will only have one data source available, but RDM does allow you to have as many data sources as you like. So in our example, we're going to name our data source Windjammer SQL DBAdmin. The DBAdmin part is just a visual reminder so that I remember that I'm logging in as the SQL administrator. Now for login mode, we offer a few options which I'll explain in just a sec, but first we have to create our database. To do this, we'll need a SQL admin account, like SA, to create the database tables and schema. Now we'll head over to the Upgrade tab, test the host, and then we will select Create Database. Then this window is where we set up some initial parameters for the default vault, which will be created first. The options currently checked are the ones we recommend in our best practices for security reasons, but they can be changed later on if you so desire. Now, while it's doing that, let me explain how we're going to have our users authenticate in RDM with the various login methods. Now, earlier you saw that there was the database login. Now that's the RDM authentication method, which will use a SQL login to directly access the SQL server. Now we're using this now to create the database, but we are going to switch over to the custom login method, and I'll show you why in just a sec. The integrated security will use the active user's Microsoft AD account to authenticate to the database, provided that the account already exists as a SQL login and the proper permissions have been set on your SQL server. Now, configuring this option has several prerequisites, and this goes beyond the scope of this video. But if that interests you, please contact a support team, and they'll do what they can to help you get started with that option. The last option is the custom login. This allows for the creation of RDM accounts for users to authenticate with, but prevents them from having direct access to the SQL database through an external tool, while allowing RDM administrators to take full advantage of RDM's role-based access control to assign permissions as needed. So it's really up to you how you want to set up the logins. If you have no issue with your users having a SQL login and direct access to the database both in RDM and outside of RDM, then by all means use that method. But if that is something that concerns you as an admin, then we suggest you go ahead with the custom Devolutions login. It takes just a few extra minor steps in the beginning, but after that, it's smooth sailing for the user. As the data source initialization finishes up, you'll be prompted concerning configuring version management. This allows you to define the minimum versions necessary to access any given data source. This prevents older RDM clients from incorrectly accessing an upgraded data source. So let's select it to automatic. Okay, so that's done. So we'll go ahead and exit out of those prompts, and then you'll be prompted with another option to import entries if you'd like. For this example, we're going to go ahead and select skip since we want to do a scratch install. Finally, we'll be prompted with a theme option where you could select a light or dark theme. Now, we're going to keep this as vanilla as possible, so we're going to go with the light theme, but if dark theme is your thing, go ahead with that. Now it's time to register our license in the database, so let's go ahead and copy and paste that in here. Then it's also pretty handy to have licenses auto-assigned so that when new users are created later on, they'll automatically receive a license. So we're going to go ahead and assign our SA account with a license for now, since that account will be used to create a few more administrative accounts. But when that's done, we'll free up this license since it will no longer be needed. Okay, so the data source is configured and linked to the newly created SQL database, but you'll notice that Bob is still logged in using the superuser SQL account SA, and he's not too comfortable using this account just to access RDM. So let's head on over to Administration and Users, and we're going to create a new administrative SQL user with just enough read-write permissions on the SQL side to accomplish what he needs to do in Remote Desktop Manager without having complete control over the SQL Server itself. Let's add a user and then select Database so it can create both an RDM login and a SQL account login. For our example, we'll name this RDM Owner. This will be your custom Devolutions linked account for creating all your other users. We'll assign RDM owner with a strong password and make sure that the create database login user is checked. For user type, we'll want admin so that this account will be set up with the correct SQL permissions as well as RDM permissions. Okay, now let's create Bob's actual admin user account. This is what he'll be using daily to access Remote Desktop Manager. But this time, let's select Custom Devolutions Authentication type. Name him Bob, and he can assign himself a strong password. And we'll also select Admin as the user type, since that's his role as System Administrator. Fill out the rest, and then we're done. Now that the initial setup is complete, it would be best if we update our data source with the correct login information to reflect that we're no longer using the SA account, but want to use Bob's administrative account instead. So we'll go to File, and then Data Sources, and we're going to edit our current data source. And the first thing I'm going to do is rename it just to Windjammer SQL, but you can name it to anything that pertains to your organization and would reflect its usage. Let's clear out the SA credentials, and then select the custom login mode. This is where we're going to put that special RDM owner SQL account. And for the user, we'll put in Bob's credentials. We'll click OK. And the system will refresh as Bob's account since we've just changed the data source information. Now let's head back into the user management section, and let's start by removing this SA account since it's no longer needed. But don't worry, this isn't going to actually delete the SQL Server login, just the associated RDM user. And then we'll also free up this RDM owner license since it isn't an actual RDM user. Now let's add our other RDM users. You'll notice as I do this that they will all be using the custom Devolutions login as opposed to the database login. So our first user is going to be another administrator, Maurice. He works alongside Bob and helps him manage the IT department. I want to point out that you can check the user must change password at next logon checkbox so that the users can set up their own strong password to access RDM once they log on for the first time. For the sake of time, I'm going to speed up the video here, but I'm just going to basically add the rest of my users. Great, so our users are all created. Now it's time to assign them to user groups. One of the great things about Remote Desktop Manager is its granular permission system as well as its role-based access control. This helps you manage who has access to which resources and what they can do with them. In RDM, permissions can be set on the vault level, folder level, and entry level. Because of assigning permissions manually can take quite a bit of time, with user groups, each user can be part of predefined permissions. Of course, as an admin, you can manually override these permissions as needed, but it makes it a whole lot easier to onboard folks once the basic groups are set. So I'm going to give it a name and a description, and then I'm going to assign which users I want to be part of this group. So I'm going to repeat this process with my other groups and we'll be right back. Okay, so we're done with user management. Now let's talk about the heart of the matter, storing content. In RDM, data is stored in a hierarchy of folders and entries, all within vaults. The number of vaults created and the way they are categorized is completely up to you. But over the years, we've seen great success in teams separating their content by departments, locations, and customer accounts. So after installing Remote Desktop Manager, you always start off with a default vault, and all the users have access to this vault. Let's rename this vault to something more fitting like Windjammer Corp. Now, since this was the default vault, I know that all my users have been assigned to it, but I'm also going to make sure that those user groups are checked as well. So let me finish creating the rest of my vaults, assign the proper users and groups to them, and we'll be back when that's all done. So in our case, we ended up with 4 vaults, one for all the employees, one for our IT administrators, one for the service desk, and an external vault for a client of ours. Okay, our vaults are created and are easily accessible from our vault selector, which is normally located on the bottom left here, but can also be placed in the top left corner if you prefer. I'll also mention that by default, each user is given their very own user vault, which is found on the bottom left of the navigation pane. This vault is only accessible to them and is a great place to store business-related entries for the user, like alarm codes, user credentials, websites, documents, and the like. We'll see more on adding entries to the user vault in the next video. As mentioned earlier, RDM boasts a powerful granular-based approach to assigning permissions on the vault, folder, and even entry level. To access vault permissions, select the Vault Settings button, which is available in the Administration tab. Then in this window, you'll notice that there is a root name. This is the name of the root folder of your vault. This is by default the data source name and the vault name. You can rename this if you like. Then to start modifying permissions, we head down to the Security section and Permissions. Earlier, we assigned which user groups and users have access to which vaults, but we haven't specified what they can do in that vault. Do we want them to have read-only access? Can they execute sessions? What about creating, editing, and deleting entries? Well, that's what this screen is for. So the add-in root is currently set to allowed, which means that entries can be placed directly in the root and don't have to necessarily be placed in a folder. I'm good with that. Then for vault settings is set to disallowed, because we don't want non-administrators having access to this screen. Now for the fun part. What can users do in this vault? Right now the permission is set to never, so let's customize this. You'll see that a whole bunch of properties have appeared. So let's take a look at the view permissions for this vault. If I select the dropdown, I'm presented with 4 options. Inherited means that the permission will inherit the default permissions from the root above. In this case, it's set to never, so users will not be allowed to see the vault's contents. Custom will allow you to give specific users or user groups access to this one view permission. Everyone will provide all those who have access to this vault to perform the view permission. And never will deny access from users performing the view action in this vault. Since all my employees have access to the default Windjammer Corp vault, I'm going to grant everyone view rights as well as connect execute rights so that they can open up websites and launch connections if there are any. If we head over to the Security tab, you'll see that these options are mainly for administrators, so I'm going to leave it to the inherited option, which was never. For attachments, they can all view, but I will give Ellen a custom permission since she works in HR and often needs to edit attachments as well as documents. For the Documentation tab, I'm going to set it pretty much the same as the Attachments one, give everybody access to view documentation, and I'm going to give Ellen specific access to be able to delete and edit documentation. Now for the More tab, I'm going to leave these to inherited, which is the never permission, because this is mainly for IT management and remote tools. Okay, so we're done setting the Windjammer Corp vault, but I do want to remind you that administrators have full access to all the permissions in the entire Remote Desktop Manager system, so be aware of that. Now we're going to head over to the Service Desk Vault and alter the permissions there. Now, we do have an alternate way of assigning permissions, and that's using what's called the Batch Grant Access. So if I click on the Grant Access button, you'll see here that I can actually click multiple permissions from each of those tabs that we saw earlier and assign specific users or user groups to the checked permissions on the left. So this is a great method if you need to give large amount of permissions to a single user or a specific group. But the customized individual option is still available. You'll notice here that the technicians have been granted specific use on these exact checkboxes that I checked earlier. Now I'm going to go ahead and repeat this process and apply specific permissions to each vault to reflect the daily tasks of those who use those vaults. Okay, so now that we've finished setting up the vault permissions for our users and user groups, there's a final piece that we want to take a look at in the initial setup of Remote Desktop Manager, and that's what we call a security provider. Out of the box, RDM encrypts all passwords and sensitive information with AES 256-bit encryption. But we understand that some organizations may require for the whole database to be encrypted. So that's what the security provider is for. It's just an additional level of encryption to the already encrypted passwords and sensitive information in Remote Desktop Manager. Now, there are several configurations available depending on which option you choose. So you may want to read up on our help topic concerning security providers. I'll leave the link in the description below. The first one is the passphrase. This is where you set up a secret phrase or password that will need to be entered once on each end user's device to access the data source. Note, if the passphrase is lost, nothing can be done to recover the data, so be sure to always have a copy in a secure location. The certificate method uses a mix of a key stored in Remote Desktop Manager and the private key contained in the certificate. The last method is the key file option, where you can encrypt the whole database using a key file provided by you. For our case, Bob will choose the passphrase method and will onboard his users later on while installing RDM on their machines. So let's put in a secure password, or we can even generate one if we want. Now we click OK. Next, a warning window will pop up letting you know that all users should be disconnected from the database while the security provider is being applied. And then, if you are applying a security provider after having using Remote Desktop Manager for a while, all past version history details will no longer be available for comparison. Also to note is that if you have a lot of entries in your database, this process could take some time. But since our setup is brand new, it won't take very long at all. All right, there we have it. Now, the next time another user logs in, since we are using the passphrase method, Bob will have to enter in the secure passphrase one time on each user's workstation. If this was using the certificate method, Bob would have to deploy it like he normally deploys certificates in his infrastructure. So now that Remote Desktop Manager has been configured, we have to decide how we'll choose to deploy this to our end users. This process involves three aspects: the Remote Desktop Manager application, the data source configuration, and the security provider encryption method. For the installation of Remote Desktop Manager, each user could download the exe or MSI file themselves and install it. They would then need to add a data source and fill in the required information manually, like we did for Bob at the beginning of this video. Now, Bob could also export the data source configuration and send it to them so they could import it themselves. But this could all become quite tedious and still require a lot of credentials to be entered in manually. So this would probably be the most inefficient method. So there must be a better way to do this. And there is, thanks to the custom installer service. The custom installer allows an administrator to create their very own MSI package file that includes the proper version of Remote Desktop Manager, along with the already filled in data source information. The MSI can then be manually installed or silently pushed to workstations using a deployment tool. So needless to say, that's the option we're going to opt for. Now, in order to use the custom installer, all you need is a Devolutions account, which Bob already has. So to access the custom installer, go to File and Devolutions account. Make sure you're logged in as the administrator user account. Then select Custom Installer and choose New Package. Then select the version of RDM you want to install. You can then edit a name and description if you'd like. Then select Create. Now, in the installer package generator, there are specific options you can choose from, but we're most concerned about here is the data source we want to package inside. Once you select the data source and click generate, the process will begin and the administrator will receive an email when it is completed. You can also see when it's completed in the generation column here. But if you're curious, you can also go to your Devolutions account portal and click on the RDM online services, and then you'll see the custom installer tab and you'll be able to see the status of the file right there. All right, so I received the email and I can also notice here that the file has been generated. So I'm going to go ahead and download the MSI file. As I mentioned earlier, we can either deploy this using a tool or install it manually. So let's install this on Maurice's workstation and guide him through the process of what he needs to do next. So we're on Maurice's computer and we're going to fire up Remote Desktop Manager for the first time. Now he'll be prompted to put in his username, which is Maurice, and the password that Bob has given to him. Once that happens, he'll be prompted to put in that old password and put in a new strong password. And since we decided to use the passphrase method for the encryption, he'll have to type it in here or the administrator can put it in for him. Once that's all done, he now has access to Remote Desktop Manager and he is ready to go. Well, there you have it. We just got Bob and his team of IT pros set up with a shiny new RDM installation complete with users, groups, vaults, and basic permissions. Now in our next video, we'll show users how to navigate the RDM interface, add credentials, remote connections, and websites, as well as launch sessions and get stuff done in Remote Desktop Manager. For more help and resources, feel free to visit support.devolutions.net, where you can access help topics and knowledge base articles, and also be part of our forum, where our team leaders and developers are actively participating. And don't forget to contact our support team if you need any help. They'll be more than happy to help you along your RDM journey. See you in the next video.